For almost all of human history, nobody knew what time it was. There were no clocks to divide the day into hours, no calendars to number the months, and no way to look ahead and say exactly how many days remained before winter arrived. Yet the people who lived in this world were not lost in confusion. They found food, raised children, traveled across enormous landscapes, remembered when animals would return, and survived for thousands of generations without measuring time in the way we do today. The strange paradox is that modern civilization depends on counting time with extraordinary precision, while prehistoric humans depended on something far less exact, but no less important: paying attention to the repeating patterns of the natural world. A flowering plant, the return of migrating birds, the length of a shadow, the position of familiar stars, or the feeling of colder air after sunset could carry meaning that no clock face ever could. They lived in a world where time was not something displayed on a wall, but something experienced directly through the land, the sky, and the changing seasons. And if a person spent an entire lifetime without counting hours, weeks, months, or years, what exactly would time have felt like? Imagine waking up in a world where asking for the time would have no meaning at all. There is no clock hanging on a wall, no watch resting in a pocket, and no calendar marking the passing of days. Nobody can tell you whether it is Monday or Friday because those concepts do not yet exist. Yet for the overwhelming majority of human history, people lived exactly this way. Long before cities, governments, written records, or organized systems of timekeeping, prehistoric humans still managed to find food, raise children, travel across immense landscapes, and survive through changing seasons. The first thing we must understand is that they were not living without time. The sun still rose each morning and disappeared each evening. The moon continued its endless cycle across the night sky. Winters arrived, summers followed, and generations were born, matured, and passed away. Time itself was always present. What did not exist was the habit of measuring it with numbers. Modern people often experience time as something separate from the natural world. We see it displayed on screens, printed on calendars, and divided into hours, minutes, and seconds. Our schedules depend on precise measurements. We wake at a certain hour, attend appointments at a certain minute, and often organize entire lives around systems of counting. Prehistoric humans experienced something very different. Rather than arranging life around numerical units, they organized it around events and conditions. A day began when enough light appeared to move safely through the landscape. Work continued while visibility remained good. Rest came when darkness made activity difficult. There was little need to know an exact hour, because survival rarely depended on exact hours. Instead, survival depended on attention. A person needed to notice the changing position of the sun, the movement of clouds, the arrival of colder winds, or the behavior of nearby animals. These observations carried practical information that mattered far more than a numbered clock ever could. Archaeologists and anthropologists often describe prehistoric communities as highly skilled observers of their environment. Such skills were not optional, they were essential. People learned when certain plants became edible, when fish appeared in rivers, when migrating animals returned to familiar routes, and when seasonal weather patterns were likely to change. Knowledge of these repeating cycles was accumulated over generations and passed through memory, experience, and observation. In many ways, this knowledge functioned as a form of timekeeping, even though nobody would have called it that. The return of a particular bird species could signal the approach of a new season. The appearance of certain stars in the night sky might indicate a familiar period of the year. The length of daylight itself provided information about the world ahead. Because modern life is so deeply connected to clocks and calendars, it is easy to assume that human societies have always depended on them. Yet these tools are relatively recent inventions when compared with the vast span of human existence. For tens of thousands of years, people organized their lives successfully without knowing the date or checking the time. They lived within a framework created by recurring natural patterns rather than artificial measurements. To begin understanding how prehistoric humans lived before clocks and calendars, we must set aside the modern belief that time has always been something counted. For most of human history, time was something observed, remembered, and experienced directly through the land, the sky, and the living world itself. One of the easiest mistakes to make when thinking about prehistoric life is to imagine people constantly confused because they lacked clocks. From a modern perspective, that assumption feels reasonable. After all, many daily activities today depend on knowing the exact time. Trains depart according to schedules, businesses open and close at predetermined hours. Schools, workplaces, and appointments all rely on synchronized clocks. Remove those systems from modern society, and much of everyday life would become difficult to coordinate. Yet prehistoric humans were living in a completely different world, one in which precise timekeeping offered far fewer advantages than it does today. A hunter did not need to know it was 7:30 in the morning before leaving camp. A gathering expedition did not begin because a clock announced the start of the day. Instead, activities were triggered by conditions that could be directly observed. If there was enough daylight to travel, people traveled. If weather conditions were favorable, hunting could begin. If darkness approached, people prepared for the night. Decisions were often based on immediate environmental information rather than abstract measurements of time. In many cases, knowing the exact hour would not have changed what needed to be done. Consider a small prehistoric group living as hunter-gatherers. Their survival depended on obtaining food, locating water, maintaining shelter, and responding to changing conditions in the landscape around them. None of these tasks required a clock. What mattered was whether animals were present, whether edible plants were available, whether storms were approaching, or whether daylight remained. These were realities that could be observed directly. The natural world itself provided the signals needed to organize daily life. Human bodies also played an important role. Long before artificial lighting extended activity deep into the night, most people lived much closer to natural cycles of light and darkness. Research on human biology suggests that exposure to sunlight strongly influences sleep and wakefulness. Without electric lights, televisions, phones, or illuminated streets, daily rhythms tended to follow environmental patterns much more closely. People often woke near dawn because increasing light signaled the beginning of a new day. As darkness returned, activity gradually slowed. This does not mean prehistoric life was perfectly synchronized with nature at every moment, but it does mean that many timing decisions were guided by biological and environmental cues rather than by clocks. Social life functioned differently as well. In modern societies, people frequently coordinate activities with individuals who may be many miles away. Such coordination requires shared systems of timekeeping. Prehistoric communities were generally much smaller. Members of a group often lived, traveled, and worked together in close proximity. Communication happened face to face. If a hunting party planned to leave, people could simply observe when others were preparing to depart. If a communal task needed attention, the group could respond directly to the situation. Exact schedules were less important because daily interactions occurred within a much smaller social world. This does not mean prehistoric humans ignored the future, quite the opposite. They often had to think carefully about what would happen weeks or months ahead. Food shortages, seasonal weather changes, and animal migrations required planning. However, that planning was usually based on recurring natural cycles rather than numbered dates. People learned from experience that certain events tended to occur after other events. The arrival of a particular season, the return of familiar animals, or the appearance of specific plants provided information about what was likely to happen next. In this sense, prehistoric humans certainly understood time, but they understood it through relationships between events rather than through clocks. To them, knowing what was happening in the world around them was often far more useful than knowing the exact hour of the day. As we begin exploring how prehistoric humans lived before clocks and calendars, it helps to recognize that there are actually two very different ways of understanding time. The first is the way most people experience it today. Time is measured, divided, counted, and recorded. A clock tells us the hour, a calendar tells us the date. Entire societies function through shared agreements about minutes, days, months, and years. This measured form of time feels so familiar that it can seem almost inseparable from reality itself. Yet for most of human existence, people lived according to a different system that historians and anthropologists often describe as natural or ecological time. In this older way of living, time was not primarily something counted, it was something noticed. A person did not necessarily know what day it was, but they knew the weather was becoming colder. They might not have known the month, but they recognized that certain birds had returned to the region or that particular plants were beginning to appear. Rather than dividing life into abstract units, natural time connected human attention directly to changes in the surrounding world. This distinction may sound subtle, but it influences how daily life is organized. Measured time treats every hour as essentially identical. An hour on one day is expected to equal an hour on another day. Clocks are valuable because they create consistency. Natural time is different. It focuses on events and conditions rather than equal units. One day may be important because animals are migrating through a valley. Another day may be important because seasonal rains have finally arrived. The significance of time comes not from where it falls on a calendar, but from what is happening in the environment. For prehistoric humans, this approach often made practical sense because survival depended on responding to real conditions rather than adhering to fixed schedules. Evidence from hunter-gatherer societies, studied in more recent centuries, suggests that people can develop extremely sophisticated awareness of seasonal patterns without relying on written calendars. Communities learn to recognize combinations of environmental signals that indicate larger changes are approaching. The flowering of a plant, the movement of animals, the behavior of insects, or the appearance of certain stars may all contribute to an understanding of where one stands within the annual cycle. Such knowledge requires careful observation and long-term memory, but it does not require numbered dates. In many cases, these natural indicators provide information that is more directly useful than a calendar page. A date might say that spring has arrived, but the land itself reveals whether spring has truly begun in a particular place. This does not mean measured time is somehow less valuable. In fact, the development of calendars and clocks eventually allowed humans to coordinate activities across enormous distances, organize agriculture more efficiently, and build increasingly complex societies. However, those achievements came much later. During the vast majority of prehistory, people lived in a world where natural cycles provided the most important information. The rising and setting of the sun structured the day. The changing length of daylight hinted at seasonal transitions. The moon offered a visible cycle that repeated through the months. Year after year, the landscape itself became a living guide to time. Understanding this difference between natural time and measured time is essential because it helps explain why prehistoric humans were able to thrive without the tools that modern people often consider indispensable. They were not waiting for clocks to be invented so life could finally become organized. They were already living within a system of time, but it was a system written in sunlight, weather, migration, memory, and the recurring rhythms of the natural world. For a modern person, sunrise is often little more than a background event. Many people wake because an alarm sounds, rather than because the sky is growing brighter. Curtains block the morning light, electric lamps extend the evening, and daily schedules continue almost unchanged, regardless of where the sun happens to be in the sky. For prehistoric humans, however, the rising and setting of the sun formed one of the most important frameworks of everyday life. Long before clocks divided the day into hours, sunlight provided a reliable rhythm that repeated across generations. Every morning, the gradual arrival of light transformed the landscape. Details hidden by darkness became visible again. Paths could be followed, animals could be tracked, food could be gathered. Movement became safer and more efficient. The beginning of the day was not announced by a number on a clock, but by a physical change that everyone could see with their own eyes. This relationship with sunlight shaped countless decisions. A hunting party might leave shortly after dawn because animals were active and visibility was improving. Gatherers could travel through familiar territories while there was enough light to identify edible plants and avoid hazards. Children learned from an early age that daylight created opportunities that disappeared once darkness returned. In a world without artificial lighting, night dramatically reduced what could safely be accomplished. While fire provided warmth, protection, and limited illumination, it could not transform the entire landscape into a usable workspace. Beyond the glow of a campfire, darkness remained powerful. As a result, people often organized activities around the predictable cycle of daylight and nightfall. The sun also offered information throughout the day. Without needing clocks, individuals could observe the position of the sun and gain a general sense of how much daylight remained. A sun, standing high overhead, suggested that much of the day was still available. A sun approaching the horizon signaled that it was time to finish certain tasks, return to shelter, or prepare for the evening. This awareness did not require precise measurements. People did not need to know whether it was 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. What mattered was understanding where they stood within the broader flow of the day. Human biology likely reinforced this connection. The human body evolved under natural cycles of light and darkness for hundreds of thousands of years. Exposure to sunlight helps regulate biological rhythms that influence sleep, alertness, and activity. In prehistoric environments, daily life was closely linked to these rhythms because there were few technologies capable of overriding them. As daylight increased, activity often increased. As darkness spread, activity generally decreased. Although individual habits certainly varied, the overall structure of life remained strongly connected to the movement of the sun. Perhaps most importantly, sunrise and sunset were shared experiences. Every member of a community witnessed the same transitions. No special tools were required. No one needed to own a clock or understand a complex calendar system. The sky itself provided a common reference point that guided behavior across entire groups. In this sense, the sun acted as something larger than a simple source of light. It became a natural organizer of human activity, quietly shaping decisions day after day. To prehistoric humans, the passage of a day was not primarily measured by counting hours. It was experienced through the changing quality of light across the landscape, from the first glow of dawn to the final fading colors of evening. The sun was not merely something that marked time. For much of human history, it was time's most visible and dependable guide. Once the sun had established the broad structure of the day, the changing quality of light itself helped determine what activities were possible at any given moment. For prehistoric humans, light was far more than a way to see. It was a resource that influenced movement, safety, work, and decision-making. Modern societies often treat daylight and darkness as minor inconveniences because electric lighting can extend activity almost indefinitely. A person can read, work, travel, or communicate long after sunset. In prehistoric times, however, the amount of available light directly affected what people could realistically accomplish. Every day began with a gradual increase in visibility. As the first light spread across the landscape, familiar landmarks emerged from the darkness. Trails became easier to follow, distant terrain could be assessed, and signs left by animals became visible once again. This was often the period when important outdoor activities could begin. Hunters searching for game needed enough light to track movements and identify opportunities. Gatherers looking for edible plants depended on visibility to distinguish useful species from potentially harmful ones. Even routine travel became safer once the details of the environment could be clearly seen. The middle portion of the day often provided the greatest freedom of movement. With the sun high in the sky, visibility reached its maximum. Distances could be covered more efficiently, and tasks requiring careful observation could be performed more effectively. In many environments, this may have been the period when the greatest amount of work took place. Yet even here, people were not following schedules measured by hours. Instead, they were responding to conditions. The position of the sun, the temperature of the air, the availability of resources, and the needs of the group all influenced how the day unfolded. What mattered was not whether it was exactly noon, but whether the circumstances were favorable for a particular activity. As afternoon progressed, the changing angle of sunlight provided information about the time remaining before darkness. Shadows lengthened across the ground. The brightness of the landscape softened. These visual cues helped people judge whether they had enough daylight left to continue a task, or whether it was wiser to return toward shelter. Such decisions could have significant consequences. Becoming stranded far from camp after sunset could increase exposure to hazards, make navigation more difficult, and reduce opportunities for protection. Awareness of fading light therefore became an important part of daily planning. Evening brought another transition. As daylight diminished, activities naturally shifted. Attention often moved away from long-distance travel and toward the immediate needs of the community. Fires might be maintained, food prepared, tools repaired, and stories shared. Archaeological evidence suggests that fire played a central role in many prehistoric societies, providing warmth, protection, and opportunities for social interaction. Yet even with fire, nighttime remained fundamentally different from daytime. The surrounding landscape largely disappeared into darkness, encouraging a slower pace of activity. This constant movement between light and darkness created a rhythm that repeated every 24 hours without requiring clocks, calendars, or written schedules. People learned to read these changes almost automatically because their daily lives depended on them. The amount of available light influenced what could be done, where it could be done, and how long it could continue. In this way, prehistoric humans experienced the passage of time through direct observation rather than measurement. The changing light of the day acted as a guide, quietly shaping behavior from dawn until nightfall. Long before humans counted hours, they were already responding to a pattern that had governed life on Earth for millions of years. The daily cycle of light and dark, created by the turning of the planet beneath the sun. Living by the sun gave prehistoric humans a reliable guide for organizing their days, but it also created limitations that modern people rarely experience. Today, artificial lighting allows activity to continue long after sunset. Streets remain illuminated, homes stay bright throughout the evening, and many people can work, travel, or communicate at almost any hour. In the prehistoric world, however, darkness was not simply a change in atmosphere. It was a practical boundary that affected movement, safety, and daily decision-making. Once the sun disappeared below the horizon, visibility declined rapidly across the landscape. Familiar paths became harder to follow, distant landmarks faded from view, and natural obstacles such as rocks, rivers, steep slopes, or dense vegetation became more difficult to navigate safely. Even individuals who knew their surroundings well had to respect these limitations. Because of this, people often planned activities with an awareness of how much daylight remained. A hunting expedition that continued too late risked returning in darkness. A journey that seemed manageable in the afternoon could become dangerous if night arrived before shelter was reached. The setting sun, therefore, acted as a natural signal that opportunities for movement and work were gradually coming to an end. These limits became even more noticeable as the seasons changed. In many parts of the world, the amount of daylight varies significantly throughout the year. During summer, long days provided extended periods for travel, gathering, hunting, and social interaction. During winter, daylight could become much shorter, reducing the time available for many essential activities. This meant that prehistoric humans were not simply responding to sunrise and sunset each day. They were also responding to the changing length of the day itself. The rhythm of life expanded during certain seasons and contracted during others. Weather added another layer of uncertainty. Thick clouds, heavy rain, fog, snow, or storms could reduce visibility and make outdoor activities more difficult even before evening arrived. Unlike modern societies, prehistoric communities could not compensate by turning on lights or relying on technologies that overcame environmental conditions. Instead, they adjusted their behavior according to what the landscape allowed. This constant adaptation required careful observation and flexibility. Human plans could not be separated from the realities of the natural world because those realities directly shaped what was possible. The dependence on sunlight also influenced social life. Many activities worked best during daylight when people could move freely, observe one another, and cooperate across larger areas. Nighttime often encouraged a different pace. People gathered around fires, shared food, maintained tools, exchanged knowledge, and strengthened social bonds within a smaller circle of light. Fire was one of humanity's most important discoveries, providing warmth, protection, and limited illumination, but it could not erase the darkness beyond its reach. Outside the glow of a fire, the wider landscape remained largely hidden. As a result, prehistoric humans experienced a stronger contrast between day and night than most people do today. Yet these limitations were not simply obstacles. Over countless generations, humans adapted to them so successfully that they became part of the normal rhythm of existence. Rather than attempting to dominate every aspect of the environment, people learned to live within its patterns. They watched the sky because the sky affected their choices. They noticed seasonal changes because those changes influenced survival. They paid attention to daylight because daylight determined opportunities. In this way, the sun was more than a source of light or a marker of time. It quietly established the boundaries within which daily life unfolded, shaping human behavior long before clocks and calendars ever appeared. If the sun provided the framework for a single day, the seasons provided the framework for an entire year. Long before calendars divided time into numbered months, prehistoric humans were already living within a world of repeating seasonal patterns. These patterns were not abstract concepts recorded on paper. They were visible, tangible changes that affected nearly every aspect of survival. The arrival of warmer temperatures, the appearance of new plant growth, the migration of animals, the freezing of rivers, and the changing length of daylight all carried important information about what the coming weeks and months might bring. For people whose lives depended directly on the natural environment, paying attention to these signals was not a hobby or a scientific curiosity. It was a practical necessity. A community that failed to notice seasonal changes could find itself arriving too late at a hunting ground, missing an important food source, or facing harsh weather without adequate preparation. Over countless generations, humans became remarkably skilled at observing these recurring patterns and using them to guide decisions. In many ways, the landscape itself became a living calendar. Rather than saying that a particular event happened in March or October, people may have understood time through environmental markers. The blooming of certain flowers, the return of migratory birds, the appearance of young animals, or the first signs of frost could all signal that one phase of the year was ending and another was beginning. These observations allowed communities to anticipate change rather than simply react to it. Knowledge accumulated through experience gradually formed a detailed understanding of local environments. Elders who had witnessed many seasonal cycles could pass this knowledge to younger generations, helping them recognize patterns that repeated year after year. Although prehistoric people lacked written calendars, they were not living in ignorance of longer stretches of time. On the contrary, survival often depended on understanding annual cycles with considerable accuracy. A hunter-gatherer group needed to know when certain resources were likely to become available and when they would disappear again. Some food sources were abundant for only brief periods. Certain animals migrated along predictable routes. Particular plants could be gathered only during specific seasons. Missing these opportunities could have serious consequences, especially in regions where food availability fluctuated dramatically throughout the year. The environment therefore acted as a guide, constantly providing clues about what was happening and what might happen next. This approach to time differed significantly from the modern habit of consulting dates and schedules. Today, a person may know that spring officially begins on a certain day because a calendar says so. Prehistoric humans relied instead on what they could directly observe. Spring was not merely a date. It was the gradual return of warmth, the lengthening of daylight, the reappearance of familiar plants, and the renewed activity of animals across the landscape. The season announced itself through countless small changes, rather than through a number printed on a page. Because these changes unfolded gradually, people often developed a close awareness of their surroundings. They learned to notice details that revealed larger patterns. A shift in bird behavior, an unusual flowering period, or a delay in seasonal weather could all provide valuable information. By carefully observing the world around them, prehistoric humans gained something that functioned much like a calendar, even though it contained no written months and no numbered days. The passing of time was recorded not in books, but in the living rhythms of nature itself, rhythms that returned again and again across generations and quietly guided human life long before the invention of clocks or calendars. For prehistoric humans, the changing of a season rarely arrived as a sudden event. Nature did not announce the beginning of spring or the approach of winter with a single clear signal. Instead, seasons revealed themselves through many small changes that unfolded over days and weeks. A person paying close attention to the environment could notice these clues long before major changes became obvious. This ability was extremely valuable because survival often depended on anticipating the future rather than merely reacting to it. Long before written calendars existed, people learned to recognize patterns that repeated across generations. Certain birds appeared at roughly the same time each year. Particular plants began to flower after predictable changes in temperature and rainfall. Herds of animals followed migration routes that often corresponded with seasonal shifts. Rivers rose and fell according to recurring environmental conditions. None of these signs provided an exact date, yet together they formed a remarkably useful system for understanding where one stood within the annual cycle. A hunter who noticed the return of familiar migratory animals could infer that other seasonal changes would soon follow. A gatherer, observing the first emergence of certain plants, might know that additional food sources would become available in the weeks ahead. These observations helped people prepare for opportunities and challenges before they fully arrived. The sky itself offered important clues. As the year progressed, the position of sunrise and sunset slowly changed along the horizon. The length of daylight increased during some parts of the year and decreased during others. Although prehistoric humans did not possess modern astronomical knowledge, they could easily observe these visible patterns. Day after day, year after year, the sky displayed information that attentive observers could learn to recognize. Even the appearance of specific stars during certain seasons may have helped communities anticipate larger environmental changes. In many regions of the world, weather patterns also provided valuable signals. A shift in prevailing winds, The arrival of seasonal rains, or a gradual change in temperature, could indicate that one phase of the year was ending and another was beginning. These signs were rarely interpreted in isolation. People likely relied on combinations of observations rather than a single indicator. One clue alone might be misleading, but several clues appearing together created a more reliable picture of what was happening. This approach resembles how experienced farmers, fishers, and herders in some traditional societies continue to observe nature today. They often combine information from plants, animals, weather, and the sky to understand seasonal conditions in ways that can complement modern calendars. For prehistoric humans, such knowledge was even more important because there were few alternative sources of information. Experience accumulated across generations became a valuable resource. Elders who had witnessed many seasonal cycles could teach younger members of the community which signs deserved attention and how different environmental changes were connected. Over time, these observations formed a body of practical knowledge rooted in direct experience with the land. This knowledge was not perfect. Nature is complex, and seasonal patterns can vary from year to year. Unexpected weather events, droughts, floods, or unusual animal movements sometimes disrupted familiar expectations. Yet the overall system was effective enough to support human communities across vastly different environments for thousands of years. By learning to read the countless signals woven throughout the natural world, prehistoric humans developed a sophisticated awareness of seasonal change without relying on written calendars. The environment itself became a source of information, quietly revealing what had happened, what was happening, and what was likely to come next. In this way, the changing seasons were not merely endured, they were observed, interpreted, and understood through an ongoing conversation between human attention and the rhythms of the living world. For prehistoric humans, recognizing the arrival of a season was important, but remembering the full cycle of seasons was even more important. A single observation could help explain what was happening in the present, while memory helped people prepare for the future. Long before written calendars, records, or agricultural schedules existed, human communities relied on accumulated experience to understand how the year unfolded. Survival often depended on knowing not only what resources were available today, but also what resources were likely to disappear tomorrow and what opportunities might return months later. In a world where food supplies could change dramatically with the seasons, memory became one of the most valuable tools a person could possess. A group that remembered when certain fish appeared in rivers, when herds migrated through particular valleys, or when edible plants reached their peak abundance, held an important advantage. They could plan movements, organize activities, and prepare for difficult periods before those challenges arrived. This knowledge reduced uncertainty and increased the chances of survival. The importance of seasonal memory became especially clear during times of scarcity. In many prehistoric environments, food was not distributed evenly throughout the year. There were periods of abundance when resources were plentiful, and periods when obtaining food became much more difficult. Communities that remembered these recurring patterns could take action while conditions were favorable. They might gather additional resources, move toward more productive areas, or adjust their behavior in anticipation of leaner times ahead. Such decisions did not require exact dates. What mattered was understanding the sequence of events that tended to repeat from one year to the next. Memory connected the present to the past and allowed people to make informed expectations about the future. This process likely operated at both individual and collective levels. An experienced hunter might remember where animals were found during previous seasons. A knowledgeable gatherer could recognize environmental signs that younger individuals had not yet learned to interpret. Elders often played a particularly important role because they had witnessed many cycles of change over the course of their lives. Their memories extended beyond a single year and sometimes across decades of observation. By sharing stories, instructions, and practical lessons, They helped preserve information that could benefit the entire community. In this way, memory functioned almost like a living archive, storing knowledge that could not be written down because writing itself had not yet been invented. Archaeologists cannot directly observe conversations that occurred tens of thousands of years ago, but evidence from traditional oral cultures suggests that human beings are capable of preserving surprisingly detailed environmental knowledge across generations. Stories, rituals, repeated journeys, and daily practices all help reinforce memory. Important information becomes easier to remember when it is connected to meaningful experiences. For prehistoric humans, seasonal knowledge was rarely abstract. It was tied directly to finding food, avoiding danger, and sustaining life. This practical importance helped ensure that such information remained valuable and memorable. The ability to remember seasonal cycles also encouraged a long-term perspective. Modern calendars often allow people to think about future dates with little effort, but prehistoric communities relied on remembered patterns instead. They learned that certain changes were temporary and that others would eventually return. The cold of winter would not last forever. Migrating animals would appear again. Familiar plants would emerge when conditions became favorable. These expectations were not guarantees, but they provided a framework for understanding the passage of time. In a world without clocks and calendars, memory helped transform recurring natural events into a dependable guide for the future. The seasons became more than changes in weather. They became a rhythm stored in the minds of generations, quietly shaping decisions, movements, and survival across thousands of years. After watching the sun guide the rhythm of each day and the seasons shape the rhythm of each year, prehistoric humans could also look upward at night and see another pattern unfolding above them. Unlike clouds, weather, or animal movements, the moon followed a cycle that was both highly visible and remarkably regular. It changed shape night after night, growing from a thin crescent to a bright full moon before gradually fading again and beginning the cycle anew. For people living without clocks and calendars, this repeating pattern would have been difficult to ignore. Every few nights, the moon looked slightly different, providing a visible reminder that time was passing. While archaeologists continue to debate exactly how prehistoric people interpreted these changes, many researchers believe that lunar cycles may have been among the earliest natural patterns humans used to track longer stretches of time. The appeal of the moon was simple. Unlike many seasonal signals that depended on local plants, animals, or weather conditions, the moon could be observed almost anywhere. A hunter crossing open grasslands, a family camped beside a river, or a small community living near a coastline could all witness the same sequence of changing lunar phases. The moon created a rhythm that repeated roughly every 29.5 days, making it one of the most obvious recurring cycles visible to the human eye. A person did not need mathematics or written records to notice that the pattern kept returning. Over many generations, such observations may have helped people develop a broader awareness of the passage of time beyond the simple alternation of day and night. The moon also influenced the practical experience of nighttime itself. On nights when the moon was full, the landscape could appear surprisingly bright. Travel became easier, landmarks were more visible, and activities could continue beyond the reach of a campfire. During the darkest phases of the lunar cycle, however, the world beyond the firelight became far more difficult to navigate. These changing conditions meant that the moon was not merely an object in the sky. Its appearance had real consequences for how people experienced the night. Such practical differences may have encouraged closer attention to lunar patterns and helped reinforce their importance within human memory. Some of the most intriguing archaeological discoveries suggest that certain prehistoric people may have attempted to record recurring patterns long before the invention of writing. A few ancient bones and artifacts contain sequences of marks that some researchers have proposed could represent observations of lunar cycles. These interpretations remain debated because it is often impossible to know exactly why such marks were made. Nevertheless, the possibility itself reveals something important. Many scholars agree that prehistoric humans were fully capable of recognizing repeating patterns in nature and using them to organize knowledge. Whether or not particular artifacts truly represent lunar records, there is little doubt that the moon's cycle would have been one of the most noticeable natural rhythms available to early observers. Beyond its practical value, the moon may also have shaped the way people thought about longer periods of time. Unlike the sun, which marked the flow of a single day, the moon provided a cycle that stretched across many nights. It offered a visible sequence that unfolded slowly enough to be remembered and compared. A person could recall that a certain event happened when the moon was full, or when only a thin crescent remained in the sky. Such references were not calendars in the modern sense, but they provided a shared framework for discussing change and duration. Long before anyone printed a date on a page, the moon may have served as one of humanity's earliest guides for understanding that time moved not only through days and seasons, but also through recurring cycles written across the night sky. While the moon provided one of the most obvious repeating cycles in the night sky, it was far from the only pattern available to prehistoric observers. Night after night, as darkness spread across the landscape, countless stars appeared overhead. At first glance, these stars may seem random, but anyone who spent years watching the sky would eventually notice that they followed patterns of remarkable consistency. Certain groups of stars rose in particular parts of the horizon. Some appeared only during certain seasons. Others vanished for months before returning once again. Unlike clouds or weather, which could change unpredictably, the stars moved according to cycles that repeated year after year. For prehistoric humans living without clocks and calendars, these patterns may have provided some of the most reliable long-term indicators available in the natural world. The importance of the stars becomes easier to understand when we remember how different prehistoric nights were from modern ones. Today, artificial lighting hides much of the night sky for millions of people. Entire generations grow up seeing only a small fraction of the stars visible to the naked eye. Prehistoric humans lived beneath skies that were dramatically darker. On clear nights, thousands of stars would have been visible. The broad band of the Milky Way stretched across the sky with a clarity rarely experienced in most modern cities. Under such conditions, the movements of celestial objects became far more noticeable. Over time, attentive observers could recognize that the sky itself changed with the seasons. A group of stars, visible during one part of the year, might not appear at all during another. These changes created a natural connection between the heavens and events occurring on Earth. If particular stars consistently appeared around the same time that animals migrated, plants flowered, or seasonal weather shifted, those stars could become useful indicators of larger environmental changes. Archaeologists and historians believe that many ancient societies eventually developed sophisticated knowledge of these relationships. Although direct evidence from deep prehistory is often limited, it is reasonable to conclude that prehistoric humans were capable of observing such recurring patterns because they depended heavily on environmental awareness for survival. The stars also offered advantages that differed from those of the moon. Lunar phases repeated approximately every month, but the annual movement of stars helped mark much longer cycles. A person might remember that a certain season usually arrived after the appearance of a particular constellation on the horizon. Another group might associate the return of familiar stars with a period of migration or resource abundance. These observations did not require written records. Repetition itself became the teacher. Year after year, the same patterns returned, allowing knowledge to accumulate gradually across generations. The sky effectively became a vast archive of recurring information available to anyone willing to observe it closely. In some regions, the stars may also have assisted with travel and orientation. Long before compasses existed, people could use familiar celestial patterns to maintain direction during journeys, especially across open terrain where landmarks were limited. This practical value would have provided another reason to pay attention to the night sky. The more closely people observed celestial movements, the more opportunities they had to recognize larger cycles unfolding above them. What makes this relationship especially fascinating is that prehistoric humans were not studying the stars as modern astronomers do. They were not calculating orbital mechanics or measuring distances between celestial bodies. Instead, they were observing the sky as part of the living environment that surrounded them. The stars, like rivers, animals, weather, and seasons, formed part of a connected world that offered clues about the passage of time. Long before the invention of formal calendars, the night sky may have served as a kind of natural calendar of its own, helping human communities place themselves within larger cycles that extended far beyond a single day or a single season. By learning to recognize these recurring patterns, prehistoric humans transformed the sky into something more than a beautiful backdrop. It became a guide, a memory aid, and perhaps one of humanity's earliest maps of time itself. As we look deeper into the distant past, an interesting question begins to emerge. How can we know whether prehistoric humans were truly paying close attention to the sky, rather than simply living beneath it? Unlike later civilizations, they left no written astronomy books, no dated observations, and no detailed explanations of what they thought about the stars or the moon. Much of what archaeologists know must therefore be reconstructed from physical evidence that survived thousands of years. That evidence is often incomplete, and scholars sometimes disagree about how it should be interpreted. Yet despite these uncertainties, there are several reasons to believe that sky watching has deep roots in human history. One source of evidence comes from ancient artifacts that contain repeated markings arranged in patterns. Some researchers have suggested that certain engraved bones, antlers, and stone objects may represent attempts to track recurring natural cycles, possibly including lunar phases. These interpretations remain debated because a series of marks can be difficult to understand after tens of thousands of years. A pattern that appears meaningful to one researcher may seem purely decorative to another. Even so, the existence of these discussions reveals an important point. Archaeologists generally agree that prehistoric humans possessed the cognitive abilities necessary to observe recurring phenomena and record information in simple ways long before the invention of writing. Another line of evidence comes from the careful alignment of some later prehistoric structures. In various parts of the world, archaeologists have discovered monuments, stone arrangements, and ceremonial sites that appear connected to the movements of the sun or other celestial events. Some structures are aligned with the direction of sunrise or sunset during solstices, the points in the year when daylight reaches its longest or shortest duration. Others may have been positioned to emphasize particular astronomical events visible on the horizon. While many of these constructions belong to periods much later than the earliest hunter-gatherer societies, they demonstrate that humans eventually developed sophisticated traditions of sky observation. Such achievements did not emerge from nowhere. They likely grew from much older habits of paying attention to celestial patterns that had accumulated over countless generations. Evidence from traditional societies studied in more recent centuries provides another clue. Anthropologists have documented many cultures that possessed extensive knowledge of stars, lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and celestial movements despite lacking modern scientific instruments. These observations often served practical purposes, helping communities anticipate environmental changes, navigate landscapes, or organize important activities. Although prehistoric societies cannot be assumed to have behaved in exactly the same ways, these examples demonstrate that detailed astronomical knowledge can develop through long-term observation alone. Human beings do not require telescopes to recognize recurring patterns in the sky. Careful attention over many years can reveal a great deal. What makes the sky especially useful as a source of information is its consistency. Animal populations can fluctuate. Weather can be unpredictable. Plant growth may vary from year to year. The movements of celestial bodies, however, follow patterns that remain remarkably stable over long periods. A person who observes these patterns repeatedly can begin to recognize relationships between the sky and events occurring on Earth. This reliability may explain why so many human societies eventually incorporated celestial observations into their understanding of time. Although archaeologists continue to debate the details of exactly how prehistoric people interpreted the heavens, the broader picture is becoming increasingly clear. Humans have been observing the sky for a very long time. The moon, the stars, the changing positions of sunrise and sunset, and other recurring celestial events provided information that could be noticed, remembered, and shared across generations. Long before formal calendars existed, the sky offered a dependable display of repeating cycles. By watching it carefully, prehistoric humans gained access to one of the most stable sources of temporal information available in the natural world, helping them understand not only where they were, but also where they stood within the larger flow of time. In a world without calendars, one of the most difficult challenges was not simply knowing what time it was, but remembering when important things had happened. Modern people rarely think about this problem because dates are everywhere. Historical events are attached to years. Personal memories are connected to birthdays, anniversaries, school terms, and holidays. Even ordinary experiences can often be located within a framework of numbered days and months. Prehistoric humans possessed none of these tools. There were no written calendars to record events, and no universally recognized dates to anchor memories. Yet people still remembered the past, planned for the future, and passed knowledge from one generation to the next. The key difference was that memories were often organized around events rather than dates. Instead of recalling that something happened in a particular year, a person might remember that it occurred during a season of unusual flooding, shortly after the arrival of migrating animals, during a particularly harsh winter, or when a well-known elder was still alive. Time was connected to experiences and changes in the world rather than to abstract numbers. This way of remembering may feel unfamiliar to modern minds, but it was highly practical in environments where survival depended on understanding recurring patterns. If a hunting ground became productive after a certain environmental change, remembering that relationship could be far more useful than knowing a specific date. If a dangerous drought followed several seasons of poor rainfall, that memory could help future generations recognize warning signs. Knowledge became attached to meaningful events, because meaningful events were easier to remember and more relevant to daily life. Human memory naturally works this way to some extent even today. People often recall where they were during major personal or historical moments without needing to remember the exact date immediately. The event itself becomes the anchor. In prehistoric societies, where written records did not exist, this tendency likely played an even larger role. Stories became one of the most important tools for preserving such memories. Through storytelling, communities could transmit information about past experiences across many generations. A story about a difficult winter might contain practical lessons about preparation and survival. A story about a successful migration route might preserve knowledge of landscapes and resources. A story about unusual environmental conditions could help future listeners recognize similar circumstances if they occurred again. These stories were not merely entertainment. They functioned as containers of memory, carrying useful information through time. Anthropological research on oral cultures demonstrates that spoken traditions can preserve surprisingly complex knowledge for long periods when communities actively maintain and repeat them. This suggests that prehistoric humans were capable of transmitting valuable environmental and social information long before writing appeared. Collective memory, therefore, became a kind of living archive. Instead of being stored in books, information was stored in people. Elders often played an especially important role because they carried memories that stretched across decades. Their experiences connected younger generations to events that had occurred long before the young were born. In communities where survival depended heavily on environmental knowledge, such memories could be extremely valuable. The passing of an elder sometimes meant the loss of information that existed nowhere else. This reality encouraged the sharing and repetition of important knowledge so that it could survive beyond any individual lifetime. Through stories, observations, and shared experiences, communities built an understanding of the past without relying on dates or calendars. They remembered what mattered by linking memories to events, seasons, places, and people. In doing so, they created a system that allowed knowledge to travel across generations, even in a world where nobody could point to a calendar and say exactly when something had happened. Without writing, books, or calendars, every important piece of knowledge had to travel from one human mind to another. This may sound fragile from a modern perspective, but for prehistoric communities, it was simply the normal way information survived. A hunting route, the location of a reliable water source, the memory of a severe drought, the arrival time of migrating animals, or the dangers associated with a particular landscape could not be stored in documents. If such knowledge was to endure beyond a single lifetime, it had to be remembered, repeated, and shared. As a result, oral tradition became one of the most important technologies ever developed by human beings. Unlike a physical tool, it left few traces in the archaeological record, yet it may have played a greater role in human survival than many objects that archaeologists recover from ancient sites. In a world without dates, stories provided a way to organize memories and connect generations. Information was often attached to people, places, and memorable events because these were easier to remember than abstract measurements of time. A community might recall that a great flood occurred during the lifetime of a respected elder, that a successful migration happened when a particular valley was unusually rich in game, or that a dangerous winter followed several seasons of strange weather. Such memories created a sequence of events that allowed people to understand the past even without numbered years. The exact date was often less important than the lesson contained within the memory itself. What mattered was knowing what happened, why it mattered, and how similar situations might be recognized in the future. Repetition played a crucial role in preserving this knowledge. Important stories were told again and again, sometimes across many generations. Each retelling reinforced memory and helped ensure that valuable information would not disappear. Anthropologists studying oral societies have found that repeated storytelling can be remarkably effective at preserving knowledge, particularly when that knowledge is tied to survival, identity, or shared cultural practices. Human beings are naturally skilled at remembering narratives because stories create connections between events, emotions, places, and people. A list of facts can be forgotten easily, but a story often remains in memory for years. Prehistoric communities likely benefited from this tendency long before anyone understood the psychology behind it. Oral traditions also allowed information to remain flexible. Unlike written records, which preserve a fixed version of events, spoken knowledge could be adjusted as circumstances changed. New experiences could be incorporated into existing stories, and fresh observations could be added to older traditions. This flexibility may have helped communities adapt to changing environments while still maintaining continuity with the past. At the same time, the repeated retelling of important knowledge helped preserve a core body of information that remained useful across generations. In many ways, memory functioned as both archive and library, while storytelling served as the method through which that archive remained alive. Elders often occupied a central position within this system because they carried decades of accumulated experience. They remembered seasons that younger individuals had never witnessed, environmental conditions that had not occurred in many years, and lessons learned through successes and failures. Their memories connected the present generation to a deeper past. Listening to them was not merely a matter of respect. It was often a practical way of accessing information that could improve survival. Through countless conversations around fires, during journeys, and within daily life, knowledge moved continuously between generations. In this way, prehistoric humans developed a sophisticated method of preserving information without writing and remembering the past without dates. Their understanding of time was carried through stories, experiences, and shared memory, creating a living record that helped communities navigate both the present and the future. For modern people, the past often feels like a long line marked by dates. We know that certain events happened in specific years, that decades follow one another in sequence, and that our own lives can be divided into clearly measured periods. Calendars make it possible to imagine time as something that stretches backward and forward in a continuous chain of numbered units. Prehistoric humans almost certainly experienced this differently. Without years, months, or written timelines, the past was less likely to be organized as a sequence of dates and more likely to be understood through memory, relationships, places, and recurring events. This does not mean that people lacked a sense of history. On the contrary, evidence from oral cultures suggests that humans are fully capable of maintaining deep connections to the past without written records. The difference lies in how that past is structured and remembered. Instead of saying that an event occurred 50 years ago, a person might think of it as happening during the lifetime of a grandparent, before a major migration, after a severe winter, or during a period when familiar conditions were different from those of the present. Time was often measured through lived experience rather than numerical distance. In such a world, generations became important markers. A person's memory extended through parents, grandparents, and respected elders whose stories connected the living to events they had never witnessed themselves. The past was therefore not an abstract collection of dates, but a network of remembered experiences carried by real people. Certain places may also have served as anchors for memory. A valley where an important event occurred, a river associated with successful hunting, or a location remembered for hardship could preserve stories across generations. Returning to those places helped keep memories alive, linking the landscape itself to human history. The environment became not only a source of food and shelter, but also a repository of meaning. Just as people remembered the past without dates, they also imagined the future without calendars. Today, many future plans revolve around specific points in time. We schedule appointments months in advance, anticipate events on particular days, and often think about the future in terms of years. Prehistoric humans certainly planned ahead, but their planning was usually tied to expected events rather than fixed dates. A community might prepare for the return of migrating animals, the arrival of colder weather, the flowering of certain plants, or the appearance of seasonal rains. These expectations were rooted in observation and memory. People knew that certain changes tended to follow others, creating a sense of what would likely happen next. In this way, the future was not imagined as a series of numbered months waiting to arrive. It was imagined as a sequence of recurring natural events, moving steadily toward the present. This perspective may have encouraged a different relationship with uncertainty. Modern calendars often create an impression of precision. We can identify a future date even when we know little about what conditions will actually exist when that day arrives. Prehistoric humans often approached the future through patterns rather than precise measurements. They expected cycles to continue, but they also understood that nature could be unpredictable. A migration might arrive later than usual. Seasonal weather could vary. Environmental conditions might change unexpectedly. Knowledge of recurring patterns provided guidance, but experience taught that flexibility remained necessary. The past and future were therefore connected by memory rather than by numbered timelines. What had happened before offered clues about what might happen again. Through stories, observation, and accumulated experience, prehistoric humans created a framework for understanding time that did not depend on calendars. They knew where they stood in the flow of life, not because they could name the year, but because they could recognize the relationships between events, generations, seasons, and the repeating rhythms of the natural world around them. For a modern child, the idea of time often arrives very early. Adults point to clocks, mention birthdays, count days until holidays, and speak about hours, weeks, and years long before a child fully understands what those words mean. A young child may not grasp the true length of an hour, but they quickly learn that time can be represented by numbers. Prehistoric children entered a very different world. No one could point to a calendar hanging on a wall. No one could explain that a meeting would happen at 3 o'clock or that an event occurred 6 months ago. Yet children still had to learn one of the most important lessons of human life. The world changes, and those changes matter. Their first understanding of time likely emerged not through explanation but through experience. A small child did not need to know the concept of a year to notice that the weather felt different than it once had. They did not need a word for a season to realize that certain foods appeared at one part of life and disappeared during another. Learning began with comparison. Something that had been present was now absent. Something that had been small was now larger. Something that had once seemed far away had finally arrived. In this way, the earliest experience of time may have been less about counting and more about noticing change. Children are naturally attentive to change because their own lives are changing rapidly. A prehistoric child would have experienced constant evidence of growth. Clothing made from animal hides needed replacement. Walking distances gradually became easier. Tasks that once required help could eventually be completed alone. Older members of the group expected more responsibility with each passing stage of development. None of these transitions required numerical ages. A child did not need to know that they were 7 or 8 years old. The evidence of growing older was visible in everyday life. Their body changed, their abilities changed, their role within the community changed. Time revealed itself through personal transformation. Family relationships probably reinforced this understanding. Younger siblings appeared where none had existed before. Infants gradually became children. Adults developed signs of age. Grandparents moved more slowly than they once had. A child observing these changes would learn that life itself unfolds in stages. The passage of time became visible through the people around them. Unlike a clock, which measures time abstractly, human lives provided concrete examples that could be seen directly. A child might not understand how long many years actually were, but they could clearly see that babies became adults, and adults eventually became elders. The lesson was not taught through numbers. It was taught through observation of human life. Daily routines offered another source of learning. Certain activities happened after others. Meals followed successful gathering or hunting. Rest followed effort. Darkness followed daylight. Children gradually learned that events occurred in sequences. One thing led to another. Expectations formed around these sequences, helping young minds develop a sense of before and after. This ability is fundamental to human understanding of time. Long before people learned to calculate dates, they learned to place events into order. They learn that some things have already happened while others have not happened yet. For a prehistoric child, this may have been the earliest foundation of temporal awareness. Time was not a number. Time was the growing understanding that life unfolds through change, order, and experience. Before any human society invented clocks or calendars, children were already learning this lesson simply by living within the flow of everyday life. For a prehistoric child, learning about time was closely connected to learning about responsibility. In modern societies, children often encounter time as an abstract concept long before it becomes a practical necessity. They hear adults discuss schedules, school years, birthdays, and future plans. A prehistoric child experienced something different. Time became meaningful because it was tied to actions, expectations, and growing responsibilities within the community. Rather than being taught how to read a clock, they learned how to recognize when certain tasks were expected of them. Their understanding of time developed through participation in life itself. As children grew older, adults gradually introduced them to activities that were appropriate for their abilities. A very young child might remain close to caregivers, observing daily routines and learning through imitation. As confidence and physical ability increased, small responsibilities appeared. Perhaps they helped carry simple items, gathered nearby materials, watched younger children, or assisted with tasks that required little strength or experience. These changes did not happen on a specific birthday marked on a calendar. Instead, they occurred when adults judged that the child was ready. Readiness, rather than age, often determined when new responsibilities were introduced. In this way, time was experienced through progress. A child understood that life was moving forward because new expectations continued to appear. The process likely created a practical awareness of personal development. Children learned that abilities could grow through repeated effort. A task that seemed difficult at one stage of life might become routine later. Skills improved through experience rather than through the passage of a numbered age. An elder did not necessarily say, "You are now old enough." Instead, they might simply begin expecting more. The child gradually realized that they occupied a different place within the group than they once had. This realization provided another way of understanding time. Growth became visible through changing responsibilities. The passage of years revealed itself through increasing competence. Adults also taught time indirectly through preparation. Many activities required planning ahead, even in societies without formal calendars. Food might need to be processed and stored. Tools required maintenance before they were urgently needed. Shelters demanded attention before harsh conditions arrived. Children observing these activities learned that actions taken in the present often affected future outcomes. This lesson is one of the most important foundations of temporal thinking. To understand time is not only to know that events occur in sequence, it is also to understand that present decisions influence what happens later. Through everyday work, prehistoric children likely learned this principle repeatedly. The connection between effort and future results became part of their understanding of how the world functioned. Storytelling may have reinforced these lessons. Adults often shared experiences about successful decisions, mistakes, dangerous situations, and important events from the past. These stories were not simply entertainment. They frequently contained practical knowledge about what to do and what to avoid. Through such accounts, children encountered a broader sense of time extending beyond their own lives. They learned that events which occurred before their birth could still influence the present. The past became a source of guidance. At the same time, stories often contained implicit lessons about the future, showing how choices could shape outcomes. In this way, children learned to think across longer stretches of time than their immediate experience allowed. By participating in daily work, accepting growing responsibilities, and listening to the experiences of older generations, prehistoric children gradually developed a sophisticated understanding of time without relying on clocks or calendars. They learned that life unfolded through stages, that skills required patience to acquire, and that actions often carried consequences that extended into the future. Time was not taught as a mathematical system. It was taught as a lived reality woven into work, relationships, learning, and responsibility. Through these experiences, children came to understand that growing older was not simply a matter of surviving another day. It was a process of becoming capable of contributing more fully to the community around them. At some point during childhood, a remarkable change likely occurred in the mind of a prehistoric child. It was not marked by a ceremony, a birthday, or a specific age. There was no calendar to record it, and no clock to announce its arrival. Yet it may have represented one of the most important steps in the development of human thought. This was the moment when a child began to realize that experience could be used not only to understand the present, but also to anticipate the future. Until then, much of life was immediate. Events happened, and the child reacted to them. Gradually, however, repeated experiences revealed that certain situations tended to lead to familiar outcomes. The world was no longer a collection of isolated moments. It began to appear as a sequence of connected events. This understanding allowed the child to look ahead rather than merely respond. Imagine a young member of a prehistoric community accompanying older relatives through everyday activities. Over time, the child would witness similar situations occurring again and again. Certain plants appeared after particular weather conditions. Specific animals became easier to find in some periods than in others. Particular tasks were carried out before certain changes arrived. At first, these observations may have seemed unrelated. Eventually, patterns emerged. The child might notice that when one event occurred, another often followed. What had once been surprising became expected. This transition from surprise to expectation is one of the foundations of predictive thinking. The child was beginning to use memory as a guide to the future. Such learning did not require formal education. It emerged naturally through experience. Human beings are highly skilled at detecting regularities in their surroundings. Even young children search for patterns, often without realizing they are doing so. For prehistoric children, this ability carried practical importance. Predicting what might happen next could improve decision-making, reduce risk, and increase confidence. A child who successfully anticipated future events was developing a skill that would be valuable throughout life. More importantly, the child was developing a deeper understanding of time itself. The future was no longer an unknown space disconnected from the present. It became something that could sometimes be anticipated through knowledge gained from the past. This ability also transformed how children understood their own lives. Earlier in childhood, growth may have been experienced passively. They simply became older without fully reflecting on the process. As predictive thinking developed, children could begin imagining future versions of themselves. They might notice that older individuals possessed skills they did not yet have. They could observe that certain responsibilities were given only to more experienced members of the group. Gradually, they may have realized that they too would one day occupy those roles. This is a subtle but important shift. The future became personal. It was no longer only about what would happen in the world. It was also about what they themselves might become. In many ways, this represents one of the defining characteristics of human cognition. The ability to imagine future possibilities allows people to prepare, plan, and learn in ways that extend far beyond immediate circumstances. For prehistoric communities, this capacity would have contributed significantly to survival. Knowledge gained from previous experiences could be applied to situations that had not yet occurred. Children who developed this ability were not simply learning facts about the world. They were learning how to think across time. They were discovering that the past, present, and future were connected. By the time a child reached adolescence, this understanding may have become deeply integrated into everyday life. They could observe a situation and anticipate likely outcomes. They could begin preparing for events before they arrived. They could imagine future responsibilities and work toward them. Without clocks, calendars, or written schedules, they had learned something profoundly important. Time was not merely a sequence of moments passing by. It was a continuous flow in which memory could inform expectation, experience could guide preparation, and knowledge could reach beyond the present into the future. Through this realization, a prehistoric child took another step toward becoming a fully participating member of the human community. A modern person leaving home for work usually knows exactly when the journey begins. A clock provides the hour. A schedule determines when to depart. Transportation systems operate according to timetables that can be checked in advance. For prehistoric hunters, none of these tools existed, yet hunting was often one of the most important activities in daily life, and success frequently depended on timing. This raises an interesting question. How could a hunting party organize itself effectively without knowing what time it was? The answer begins with a simple reality. The hunt was organized around the behavior of animals rather than around the measurement of hours. Prehistoric hunters did not ask whether it was 6 o'clock in the morning. Instead, they paid attention to conditions that influenced where animals were likely to be and what they were likely to be doing. The focus was not on the clock, but on the opportunity. A hunting trip therefore started when circumstances seemed favorable. If visibility was poor, weather conditions were dangerous, or signs of animal activity were lacking, plans could change. The decision was often practical rather than numerical. This created a different relationship with time. Success depended less on following a schedule and more on reading the situation accurately. Once a hunt began, another challenge emerged. Modern people are accustomed to knowing how long an activity will take. A meeting may be scheduled for 1 hour. A journey may require 30 minutes. A hunting expedition in prehistory offered no such certainty. Some hunts may have ended quickly, others could continue for many hours. Occasionally, a pursuit might extend across large distances and require far more time than expected. The duration depended on countless factors: the behavior of animals, terrain, weather, visibility, and the decisions made by the hunters themselves. In this environment, flexibility was essential. Participants could not assume that events would unfold according to a precise timetable because no timetable existed. They had to adapt continuously as circumstances changed. This required patience as well as experience. A successful hunter needed to understand that opportunities could appear unexpectedly and disappear just as quickly. The ability to remain attentive for long periods was often more valuable than the ability to act at a predetermined moment. Younger members of the community likely learned this lesson gradually. They discovered that nature rarely followed exact schedules. An animal did not appear because a certain hour had arrived. It appeared when its own needs and circumstances brought it to a particular place. Hunting, therefore, required synchronizing human behavior with the behavior of other living creatures. The rhythm of the hunt was determined by the interaction between hunter and prey rather than by the movement of clock hands. Cooperation within the hunting group also worked differently from modern scheduled activities. Today, coordination often depends on precise timing. People agree to meet at specific hours because they may be separated by large distances and following independent schedules. Prehistoric hunting groups frequently traveled together from the beginning of an expedition. Communication occurred directly through observation, gestures, speech, and shared awareness of conditions. If plans needed to change, adjustments could happen immediately. There was no need to inform participants that a schedule had shifted because the group experienced the changing situation together. This created a form of coordination that depended more on attention than on precise timekeeping. Perhaps most importantly, the end of a hunt was usually defined by results rather than by duration. A hunt ended because the objective had been achieved, conditions had become unfavorable, daylight was fading, or continuing no longer seemed worthwhile. The question was not how much time had passed, but whether the purpose of the activity had been fulfilled. In this sense, prehistoric hunting reveals a broader truth about life before clocks. Many activities were organized around goals and circumstances, rather than around measured units of time. People certainly understood that time was passing, but their attention was focused on what needed to be accomplished, rather than on counting the minutes required to accomplish it. For a hunter moving across the landscape thousands of years ago, The most important question was rarely, "What time is it?" It was often something far more immediate: "What is happening right now, and what should I do next?" One of the most surprising aspects of prehistoric life is that human groups were often capable of coordinating complex activities without the precise timekeeping systems that modern societies consider essential. Today, even a small gathering may depend on clocks. People agree to meet at specific hours because they often begin from different locations and follow different schedules. If someone arrives too early or too late, plans can be disrupted. For prehistoric communities, however, cooperation developed under very different conditions. Most members of a group shared the same general environment, experienced many of the same daily routines, and spent much of their lives in close contact with one another. Because of this, coordination depended less on synchronized clocks and more on shared awareness. People often knew what others were likely to be doing because they participated in the same rhythm of life. The challenge was not to synchronize watches. The challenge was to remain attentive to the needs and movements of the community itself. Consider a group preparing to move from one location to another. In the modern world, such a departure might be scheduled for a precise hour. A prehistoric group could approach the situation differently. Departure often occurred when preparations were complete and conditions were favorable. Equipment needed to be gathered. Children needed to be ready. Weather and visibility had to be considered. Rather than forcing the group to leave because a particular time had arrived, the departure was linked to readiness. Everyone could see when the necessary conditions had been met. This created a form of coordination based on observation rather than measurement. The community moved because it was prepared to move. Similar principles likely applied to many other activities. If several individuals needed to cooperate on a task, they often did so because they were already present together or because the situation itself made cooperation necessary. A hunting group, for example, could gather at the moment preparations were complete rather than at an appointed hour. People communicated directly, observed one another, and adjusted as circumstances changed. This method may seem imprecise from a modern perspective, yet it worked effectively within smaller communities where face-to-face interaction was common. Human beings are highly social creatures, and much coordination occurs naturally through observation. We constantly monitor the behavior of those around us, often without realizing it. Prehistoric communities relied heavily on this ability. Shared routines also helped reduce the need for exact scheduling. When people regularly performed similar activities under similar conditions, expectations developed naturally. Members of a group learned the general flow of daily life and could anticipate what others were likely to do next. This did not require clocks because the sequence itself became familiar. Modern societies still display traces of this behavior. People often recognize when a workplace is becoming busy, when a family meal is approaching, or when a gathering is beginning, without constantly checking the time. Prehistoric communities depended on such social awareness to a much greater degree. Communication played an important role as well. Unlike large modern organizations where individuals may be separated by significant distances, prehistoric groups were often small enough for information to spread directly. A message could be spoken, observed, or demonstrated rather than transmitted through schedules and timetables. Plans remained flexible because everyone involved could respond to changing circumstances together. If weather shifted unexpectedly or a new opportunity appeared, adjustments could be made immediately. This flexibility was often an advantage in environments where conditions could change rapidly. The goal was not to follow a rigid plan regardless of circumstances. The goal was to respond effectively to reality as it unfolded. Perhaps the most important difference is that prehistoric coordination was often centered on shared objectives rather than shared schedules. People gathered because a task needed to be completed, a journey needed to be made, or a challenge needed to be addressed. The focus remained on the activity itself. Time mattered, but it mattered indirectly through conditions and opportunities rather than through exact numerical measurements. A community succeeded not because everyone knew the precise hour, but because everyone understood what needed to be done and paid attention to the same world around them. In this way, cooperation emerged from common experience, mutual observation, and shared purpose. Long before clocks allowed people to coordinate by the minute, human groups were already coordinating through something older and perhaps more fundamental: the ability to understand one another and respond together to the changing circumstances of life. No matter how experienced a prehistoric community became, there was one reality that could never be fully removed from daily life: uncertainty. A group could prepare carefully for a journey, gather supplies, discuss a destination, and begin traveling with every expectation that the day would unfold as planned, only to discover that the world had other ideas. A river that was usually shallow could become difficult to cross after unexpected rain. A familiar route might be blocked by fallen trees, flooding, or shifting terrain. Animals that had often been found in a particular location could be nowhere to be seen. A stretch of clear weather could suddenly give way to strong winds or dangerous storms. For people living without clocks and calendars, these disruptions were not rare exceptions. They were ordinary parts of existence. Modern schedules often encourage the belief that the future can be organized with great precision. A meeting is expected to begin at a certain time. A journey is expected to take a certain number of hours. A task is expected to be completed by a specific deadline. Prehistoric humans rarely had such certainty. Their plans were shaped by conditions that could change rapidly and sometimes without warning. Because of this, they learned a lesson that was reinforced throughout life. Preparation was important, but flexibility was equally important. A plan was valuable only as long as reality allowed it to remain useful. If circumstances changed, people had to change with them. Consider a hunting expedition that had been anticipated for days. Tracks may have suggested that animals were nearby. Previous experience may have indicated that the area was promising. Yet after hours of searching, there might be little evidence of prey. In such a situation, continuing simply because the original plan said so could waste energy and reduce the chances of success. Hunters had to decide whether to continue, change direction, or abandon the effort entirely. Good judgment often depended on recognizing when a plan no longer matched reality. The same principle applied to travel, gathering, shelter construction, and many other activities. Success frequently came not from rigid determination but from the ability to adjust decisions as new information appeared. Weather created similar challenges. Even communities that understood local conditions very well could not predict every change. A sudden cold spell, unexpected rainfall, or prolonged period of unfavorable conditions could alter daily life dramatically. These experiences taught people to avoid relying too heavily on assumptions about the future. Expectations were useful, but certainty was dangerous. Human beings could observe trends, recognize opportunities, and make preparations, yet they could never fully control the environment around them. Children growing up in such communities would have seen this repeatedly. They would have watched adults modify plans, postpone activities, choose alternative routes, and respond calmly to changing circumstances. Through observation and participation, they learned that adaptability was not a sign of failure, it was a sign of wisdom. The goal was not to force reality to match expectations. The goal was to understand reality well enough to respond effectively when it changed. This perspective may have shaped how prehistoric people understood time itself. Rather than viewing the future as a fixed path waiting to unfold according to schedule, they likely experienced it as a range of possibilities influenced by both preparation and circumstance. The future could be anticipated, but it could not be guaranteed. This awareness encouraged attentiveness, patience, and resilience. Long before humanity learned to divide days into hours and minutes, people had already learned one of the most enduring lessons about time. No matter how carefully the future is imagined, the world always retains the power to surprise us, and survival often depends less on predicting every change than on responding wisely when change inevitably arrives. Long before calendars existed, and long before anyone attempted to divide a year into named months or numbered days, human beings had already become skilled observers of change. They could recognize the return of familiar conditions, anticipate certain seasonal events, and remember patterns that repeated across many years. Yet observation alone had an important limitation. Memory belonged to people, and people did not live forever. A particularly knowledgeable elder might remember decades of experience, but when that person died, much of that knowledge risked disappearing as well. Stories helped preserve information, and oral traditions could carry knowledge across generations, but there may have come a point when some individuals began wondering whether certain observations could be preserved in a more permanent form. Archaeologists cannot identify the exact moment when this idea first appeared, but scattered clues suggest that some prehistoric humans may have experimented with ways of recording recurring events long before writing was invented. Among the most intriguing discoveries are ancient bones, antlers, stones, and other objects that contain sequences of carefully carved marks. At first glance, these marks can appear simple, yet they have inspired decades of debate among researchers. Some scholars have proposed that certain examples may represent attempts to count, track, or remember recurring natural phenomena. Others argue that the marks may have served entirely different purposes. The truth is that no one can know with complete certainty, because the people who created these objects left no written explanation behind. What makes these artifacts important is not that they provide definitive proof of prehistoric calendars, but that they reveal something about the human mind. They demonstrate that prehistoric humans were capable of creating symbols, preserving information outside their own memories, and leaving physical traces of ideas they considered important. One of the most frequently discussed examples is the possibility that some markings were connected to the phases of the moon. Because the moon changes in a visible and predictable sequence, it is one of the easiest long-term cycles for people to observe without special tools. A person watching the night sky could notice that the pattern repeated again and again. Some researchers have wondered whether repeated marks on certain artifacts might have helped track these changes. This interpretation remains controversial, and many archaeologists caution against drawing firm conclusions. Nevertheless, even the debate itself highlights an important reality. By this stage of human history, people were clearly capable of recognizing recurring patterns and thinking about ways to preserve information related to them. The desire to remember appears to have been growing alongside the desire to observe. This represents a subtle but important shift. Earlier generations may have relied primarily on memory and storytelling to maintain knowledge about time. Now there are hints that some individuals may have begun experimenting with physical reminders. A carved mark could outlast the moment in which it was created. Unlike memory, it remained visible even when attention moved elsewhere. A sequence of marks could potentially preserve information across weeks, months, or even years. Whether these objects tracked lunar cycles, important events, quantities, or something entirely different, they reveal a growing interest in recording information rather than merely experiencing it. In many ways, this marks the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's relationship with time. People were no longer content simply to notice that changes occurred. Increasingly, they may have wanted to remember those changes with greater accuracy. They may have wanted to compare one cycle with another, preserve observations for future use, or share information in ways that did not depend entirely on spoken memory. The first attempts were almost certainly simple and limited. They were not calendars in the modern sense. They did not divide years into organized systems or provide exact dates, yet they suggest something profoundly human, the desire to leave a record of experience behind. Before clocks, before calendars, and before writing itself, there are signs that some prehistoric people had already begun taking the first tentative steps toward recording the passage of time rather than merely living within it. As human communities gradually became larger, more experienced, and more knowledgeable about the environments in which they lived, remembering important information grew increasingly difficult. A small group could often rely on direct experience. Most members had witnessed the same events, traveled through the same landscapes, and shared many of the same challenges. Knowledge moved naturally through conversation and observation, but as generations passed, the amount of useful information accumulated steadily. People learned which areas provided reliable food during difficult periods, which routes were safest during seasonal movements, which locations became dangerous under certain conditions, and which environmental changes often preceded important events. Remembering all of this required more than intelligence alone. It required systems, whether formal or informal, that helped preserve knowledge across time. This may help explain why the idea of recording recurring events became increasingly valuable. The more people learned, the greater the need to ensure that important observations would not simply disappear. A successful community depended not only on what its members knew today, but also on what they remembered from the past. Every generation inherited lessons gathered by those who came before. Some of those lessons concerned places, others concerned animals, weather, resources, or social practices. Many of them, however, shared a common feature. They involved repetition. Certain events happened again and again. Particular changes tended to occur in recognizable sequences. Opportunities often returned after predictable intervals. Once people became aware of these recurring relationships, preserving knowledge about them became increasingly useful. The goal was not merely to remember what had happened. The goal was to improve the ability to anticipate what might happen next. In this sense, tracking recurring cycles was closely connected to planning. The better a community understood repetition, the better prepared it could be for the future. Consider a group that had observed over many years that a particular region became especially productive during a certain part of the annual cycle. Knowledge of that pattern could influence decisions about movement, resource gathering, and preparation. If the pattern was remembered accurately, future generations could benefit from experiences they had never personally witnessed. The same principle applied to many aspects of life. Information gained during one period could help guide actions during another. As communities accumulated more knowledge, the value of preserving that information increased. Memory remained essential, but memory alone could be vulnerable. People forgot details. Individuals died. Stories changed slightly as they were retold. None of this prevented knowledge from surviving, but it created incentives to find additional ways of reinforcing important information. This is one reason archaeologists are interested in evidence suggesting that prehistoric humans may have experimented with physical marks or symbolic records. Even simple reminders could help support memory. A visible mark could preserve a connection to an observation long after the original moment had passed. More importantly, it could help transform a temporary experience into something that endured. Communities were beginning to think not only about what they knew, but also about how knowledge itself could survive. This development reflects a broader change in human thinking. Earlier generations had largely focused on recognizing patterns. Now, there are signs that some people were becoming interested in preserving those patterns for future reference. The distinction may seem small, but its consequences were profound. Once humans began recording information outside their own minds, even in very simple ways, new possibilities emerged. Observations could be compared across longer periods. Knowledge could be reinforced through physical reminders. Future generations could potentially inherit information in forms that extended beyond memory and storytelling alone. The earliest efforts were undoubtedly modest. They were not yet calendars, nor were they sophisticated systems of measurement. Yet they reveal an important shift in perspective. People were increasingly aware that recurring events contained valuable information and that preserving this information could provide advantages that extended far beyond a single lifetime. In this gradual movement from observation toward record-keeping, we can see the foundations of a process that would eventually lead to calendars, written records, and more formal systems of timekeeping. The path was still long, but the desire to remember recurring cycles more reliably had already begun to reshape humanity's relationship with time. The journey from simple observations to formal calendars was not a straight path, nor was it a transformation that happened everywhere at the same time. It unfolded gradually across thousands of years as human societies changed. For much of prehistory, people had little need for highly precise systems of timekeeping. Small communities could often rely on memory, experience, and direct observation of the environment. Knowledge about important events was carried through stories, daily practices, and shared traditions. Yet as populations increased and ways of life became more complex, the limitations of these methods became easier to see. Larger groups required more coordination. Long-distance exchanges connected people who did not share the same immediate experiences. Settlements became more permanent, and decisions increasingly depended on planning for events that might occur months rather than days in the future. Under these conditions, the ability to organize time more systematically became increasingly valuable. One of the most important developments was the gradual shift from simply noticing recurring events to intentionally comparing them. Earlier generations may have recognized that certain changes tended to happen around the same period each year. Later generations began paying closer attention to how these events related to one another. The appearance of a particular star near the horizon might occur around the same time as a seasonal environmental change. The position of the sunrise could gradually shift across the year before returning again. The moon continued its familiar cycle regardless of what was happening on the ground below. These observations revealed that different natural processes could be connected. Once people started recognizing these relationships, they gained new ways of estimating where they stood within larger cycles. This did not yet produce calendars, but it created the knowledge from which calendars would eventually emerge. Permanent settlements played an important role in this transformation. When communities remained in one place for longer periods, it became easier to compare observations across many years. A location that was occupied continuously allowed people to notice details that might be difficult to detect during a highly mobile lifestyle. The same horizon could be observed repeatedly. The same seasonal changes could be compared from year to year. Over time, this encouraged more systematic attention to recurring events. Archaeological evidence from later prehistoric periods suggests that some communities began constructing monuments, stone arrangements, or ceremonial sites that aligned with particular solar events, such as solstices. These structures did not function like modern clocks, but they demonstrate growing interest in marking significant moments within larger cycles. People were beginning to create physical references that connected human activities to recurring patterns in the sky. This represented another step toward formal timekeeping. Agriculture accelerated this process even further wherever it developed. Farming required decisions that depended heavily on timing. Plant too early and crops might fail. Plant too late and harvests could suffer. The ability to anticipate seasonal changes became increasingly important. Communities that could organize agricultural activities more effectively often enjoyed significant advantages. As a result, observations that had once been useful became essential. Knowledge about the annual cycle gained greater practical value, encouraging more careful tracking of recurring events. Gradually, methods for organizing time became more structured. Calendars did not appear because people suddenly became interested in numbers. They appeared because generations of observers had accumulated a vast body of knowledge about recurring change and needed better ways to organize it. The first calendars were therefore not inventions that replaced nature. They were tools that helped people interpret nature more consistently. Behind every early calendar stood countless unnamed observers who had spent generations watching horizons, following seasonal shifts, comparing experiences, and preserving knowledge. Their observations created the foundation upon which later civilizations would build increasingly sophisticated systems of timekeeping. By the time formal calendars finally emerged, humanity had already spent thousands of years learning one essential lesson. The world moved according to patterns that could be recognized, remembered, and eventually organized. Calendars were not the beginning of that understanding, they were the result of it. For tens of thousands of years, human beings had lived in a world where the future was approached through experience rather than through dates. People prepared for what was coming by remembering what had happened before. They listened to stories, learned from older generations, observed changes in their surroundings, and gradually built expectations about what might happen next. If a community wanted to prepare for a difficult season, they relied on knowledge passed down through memory and observation. If they expected resources to become available, they watched for familiar signs and compared current conditions with previous experiences. This way of living had supported humanity for an immense span of time, yet it also had limits. Knowledge could be forgotten, memories could fade. Different groups could interpret the same events differently. As human communities became larger and more complex, relying entirely on personal experience and oral tradition became increasingly difficult. Slowly, in different regions of the world and at different moments in history, people began developing calendars. At first, these systems were simple, often tied closely to natural events that everyone could observe. Yet even the earliest calendars introduced something new into human life. For the first time, people could refer to future moments using a shared framework that existed outside individual memory. This change may seem ordinary today because modern life is surrounded by calendars, but for the people experiencing it, the transformation was profound. A future event no longer had to be described only in relation to a season, a migration, a harvest, or the memory of an elder. It could increasingly be connected to a recognized position within a common system. This allowed communities to think about the future in new ways. Instead of waiting for every environmental signal to appear, people could begin preparing earlier and coordinating their actions with greater confidence. Larger groups benefited especially from this development. In small communities, direct communication was often enough to organize activities. Everyone shared many of the same experiences and could observe similar conditions. As populations grew, however, coordination became more challenging. People needed methods for organizing work, ceremonies, exchanges, and other activities that involved many participants. Calendars helped solve this problem by providing a shared reference that everyone could understand. A community could now connect plans to agreed points in time rather than relying solely on immediate observation. This created opportunities for cooperation on a larger scale than had previously been possible. The invention of calendars also changed how people imagined the future itself. Earlier generations often thought in terms of expected events. The future arrived when certain conditions appeared. Calendars encouraged a different perspective. People could count forward, estimate how much time remained before an anticipated activity, and organize preparations around periods that had not yet arrived. The future became something that could be mapped in advance. This did not remove uncertainty from life, but it expanded humanity's ability to plan beyond the present moment. Decisions could increasingly be linked to a framework that extended into the future, rather than depending entirely on immediate circumstances. Another important change involved the preservation of knowledge. Calendars made it easier to compare events across longer periods and helped communities organize information in more systematic ways. Experiences that once survived mainly through memory could now be connected to recurring points within a larger structure. Over time, this contributed to the development of historical records, administrative systems, and more sophisticated forms of planning. Yet despite all these innovations, calendars did not replace the natural world that had guided humanity for so long. The earliest calendars were built from observations of the same recurring phenomena that prehistoric humans had been studying for generations. The movement of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the return of seasonal changes remained the foundation upon which these systems rested. What changed was not nature itself, but humanity's ability to organize its understanding of nature. Calendars transformed scattered observations into shared systems, helping people coordinate actions, preserve knowledge, and imagine the future in ways that had never before been possible. In doing so, they marked one of the most significant turning points in the long history of how humans understood and lived within the passage of time. For most of prehistory, time belonged primarily to the natural world. People understood it through changing conditions, recurring events, and experiences shared within their communities. The arrival of a season mattered because it affected food, movement, shelter, and survival. The passage of time was closely tied to practical realities that could be observed directly. As calendars became more common, however, a subtle transformation began to take place. Time gradually acquired a second role. It remained connected to nature, but it also became a tool for organizing human society. This change did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly as communities grew larger, settlements became more permanent, and cooperation involved increasing numbers of people. The challenge facing these societies was not simply understanding the environment, it was coordinating the activities of many individuals whose actions needed to fit together. Calendars helped meet this challenge by providing a shared structure that existed beyond personal experience. A person no longer needed to witness every environmental sign personally in order to participate in collective activities. Instead, communities could agree on common points within a calendar and organize behavior around them. This made it possible for larger groups to function with greater consistency. Activities that once depended heavily on direct observation could increasingly be planned according to a recognized system. The effects of this change reached into many aspects of life. Agricultural communities, for example, benefited from having common expectations about when important tasks should occur. Religious ceremonies could be organized so that large numbers of people participated together. Trade became easier when communities shared methods for understanding longer periods of time. Construction projects that required cooperation among many individuals could be planned more effectively. None of these developments would have been impossible without calendars, but calendars made them easier to manage on a larger scale. Time was becoming something that connected people to one another as much as it connected them to nature. A shared calendar created a shared rhythm for society itself. Another important consequence was that time began to function as a form of social coordination. In earlier periods, the environment often determined when activities occurred. As organized systems became more influential, communities increasingly determined certain activities for themselves. Human decisions started playing a larger role in shaping collective rhythms. This did not mean that natural cycles ceased to matter. Crops still depended on weather. Seasonal changes continued to affect daily life. The sun and moon remained fundamental reference points, yet a new layer had been added. Human societies were beginning to create schedules, traditions, obligations, and expectations that operated within the framework provided by calendars. Time was becoming woven into institutions as well as landscapes. This development helped support larger and more complex forms of social organization. People who lived far apart could still participate in shared systems because they understood the same temporal framework. Communities gained the ability to coordinate activities across wider regions and longer periods. As civilizations continued to develop, calendars became increasingly important for administration, governance, religion, trade, and cultural identity. Entire societies could orient themselves around common understandings of time. This represented a remarkable achievement. Human beings had created systems capable of linking the actions of thousands or even millions of individuals through a shared understanding of when things should happen. Yet despite this transformation, it is important to remember that social time never fully replaced natural time. The calendars that organized human societies were ultimately derived from observations of recurring events in the natural world. Beneath every social schedule remained the movement of celestial bodies and the rhythms of the environment that had guided humanity for countless generations. What changed was not the existence of those rhythms, but humanity's relationship with them. Time was no longer only something people observed. It was increasingly something they organized, shared, and used to coordinate collective life. In this way, calendars helped transform time from a primarily environmental experience into one of the most important foundations of human society, creating a bridge between the rhythms of nature and the growing complexity of civilization. As calendars became more common and human societies grew increasingly organized around shared systems of time, people gained many advantages. Communities could coordinate activities more effectively, plan further into the future, preserve knowledge with greater accuracy, and manage larger populations than ever before. Few developments in human history have been as influential. Yet every tool changes not only what people can do, but also how they experience the world. Calendars helped humans organize time, but they also gradually changed humanity's relationship with it. For prehistoric people, time was often encountered directly through events and experiences. A season announced itself through changing weather, shifting landscapes, and the behavior of living things. A journey ended when a destination was reached. A task was complete when its purpose had been fulfilled. Attention remained focused on what was happening in the world itself. As societies became increasingly structured around calendars and schedules, another way of experiencing time began to emerge. People became more aware of time as something that could be measured, counted, and divided into increasingly precise units. This shift brought many practical benefits, but it also altered where attention was directed. Instead of looking primarily at conditions, people increasingly looked at systems that represented those conditions. A date on a calendar could announce the arrival of a season before anyone stepped outside to notice it. A scheduled activity could begin because the calendar said it should begin, even if environmental conditions suggested otherwise. Gradually, human life became less dependent on direct observation and more dependent on shared systems of organization. This transformation was neither good nor bad in itself. It was simply a consequence of living within larger and more complex societies. Nevertheless, it changed the experience of time in subtle ways. Earlier generations often understood time through relationships between events. One thing happened after another, and meaning emerged from those connections. Later generations increasingly understood time through positions within a larger framework. Events became attached to dates, schedules, and sequences that existed independently of personal experience. Time was becoming more abstract. It could be discussed, recorded, and planned long before it was actually lived. Another consequence was the growing importance of precision. In prehistoric communities, a delay was often measured by circumstances. A journey took as long as necessary. A task continued until it was finished. Calendars and eventually clocks encouraged a different perspective. Activities became linked to specific moments. Expectations became tied to exact timing. Precision created new possibilities for cooperation, but it also introduced new forms of pressure. Human beings increasingly evaluated success not only by what was accomplished, but also by when it was accomplished. The passage of time became something people monitored more closely than before. This shift may have influenced how people thought about the future as well. Earlier generations often prepared for future events, while accepting considerable uncertainty about exactly when those events would occur. As systems of timekeeping became more sophisticated, people gained greater confidence in those ability to organize future plans. This confidence supported remarkable achievements, yet it could also create the impression that time itself was something to be managed rather than something to be experienced. The future became more structured, but perhaps also more demanding. Deadlines, schedules, and obligations gradually joined the rhythms that had once been provided primarily by nature. Even so, the older relationship with time never disappeared completely. The sun continued to rise and set regardless of human calendars. Seasons continued to change according to forces far older than civilization. People still experienced aging, growth, memory, and anticipation in deeply personal ways that no system could fully capture. Beneath every schedule remained the same reality that prehistoric humans had known. Life unfolds through change. Calendars helped organize that change, but they did not create it. In this sense, the invention of calendars involved both a gain and a trade-off. Humanity gained extraordinary new abilities to coordinate, plan, and preserve knowledge. At the same time, many people became slightly more distant from the direct experience of time as it appears in the natural world. The rhythms of society grew stronger, while the rhythms of nature became easier to overlook. Yet both continued to exist together. Human beings learned to live according to calendars, but they never completely escaped the older patterns that had guided their ancestors for thousands of generations. After exploring the many ways prehistoric humans understood and navigated the passage of time, we can finally return to the question that has guided this entire journey. How did people live before clocks and calendars? At first glance, the answer may seem obvious. They simply lived without them. Yet the deeper we look, the more remarkable that answer becomes. Modern life is surrounded by systems that constantly measure time. Clocks tell us when to wake, when to work, when to travel, and when to rest. Calendars help organize days, months, and years into orderly sequences. Because these tools are so familiar, it is easy to assume that human beings have always needed them. The story of prehistory suggests otherwise. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, people lived without any of these systems, yet they still raised families, traveled across vast landscapes, accumulated knowledge, adapted to changing climates, cooperated with one another, and survived in environments that were often far more challenging than those faced by most people today. The key to understanding this apparent paradox lies in recognizing that prehistoric humans did not live without time. They lived without formal timekeeping. Time itself remained present in every aspect of their lives. They experienced it through growth, aging, memory, responsibility, preparation, and change. Children became adults, adults became elders, journeys began and ended. Skills improved through practice. Communities adapted to new circumstances. Life unfolded through a continuous sequence of experiences that revealed the passage of time without requiring precise measurement. What made this possible was the human ability to connect events together. Prehistoric people understood that actions had consequences, that preparation influenced future outcomes, and that knowledge gained from experience could be applied to situations that had not yet occurred. They did not need clocks to understand that some activities required patience or that some goals could only be achieved gradually. They learned these lessons directly through participation in everyday life. In many respects, their understanding of time was deeply practical. Rather than focusing on abstract units such as hours and dates, they focused on relationships between events. The question was often not what time is it, but what needs to happen next. This perspective shaped how communities organized themselves. Cooperation depended on shared purpose rather than precise schedules. A journey began when preparations were complete. A task continued until it was finished. Plans remained flexible because circumstances could change. Success often depended on judgment rather than on adherence to rigid timetables. This approach allowed people to respond effectively to a world that was frequently unpredictable. At the same time, prehistoric humans were far from passive observers. They accumulated knowledge across generations, recognized recurring patterns, preserved important information through stories and traditions, and eventually began experimenting with ways of recording observations outside human memory. The long path toward calendars and formal timekeeping emerged from these efforts. Calendars did not appear because people suddenly became aware of time. They appeared because people had already spent thousands of years learning how to understand it. Seen from this perspective, the history of timekeeping becomes a story of continuity rather than replacement. The invention of calendars added new tools, but it did not erase older ways of understanding the world. Beneath every calendar remained the same human abilities that had guided prehistoric communities for generations: the ability to remember, anticipate, cooperate, learn, and adapt. These skills allowed people to navigate life long before anyone divided a day into hours or a year into numbered dates. As we return to the original question, the answer becomes clearer than it first appeared. Prehistoric humans lived before clocks and calendars by relying on abilities that remain familiar even today. They learned from experience, prepared for the future, adapted to uncertainty, and organized their lives around meaningful events rather than precise measurements. Their world was different from ours, but the minds that inhabited it were recognizably human. The absence of clocks did not leave them lost in time. Instead, it encouraged them to experience time through the unfolding realities of life itself. Although modern life is organized by clocks, calendars, schedules, and digital reminders, traces of the older prehistoric relationship with time remain surprisingly visible within us. In many ways, human beings still experience time through instincts and habits that developed long before formal systems of measurement existed. A person may know the exact date and hour, yet still feel that some days pass quickly while others seem to stretch endlessly. A calendar can record the passage of a year, but it cannot fully explain why certain memories feel close even after decades have passed, while other events seem distant despite occurring only recently. These experiences remind us that the human mind does not naturally experience time in the same precise way that clocks measure it. Deep beneath modern systems of organization, older patterns of perception continue to operate. One example can be found in the way people remember their lives. Most individuals do not organize personal memories according to exact dates. Instead, memories are often linked to significant events, relationships, achievements, losses, journeys, and transitions. Someone may remember that an event happened before moving to a new home, after the birth of a child, during a particular period of study, or while living in a certain place. This resembles the event-based understanding of time that likely characterized much of prehistoric life. Long before calendars became common, people often understood the past through meaningful experiences rather than through numbered years. Even today, many of our most important memories are arranged in much the same way. Human beings also continue to think about the future through anticipation and preparation rather than through dates alone. A person may know that an important event is scheduled months in advance, yet the emotional experience of waiting often depends on milestones and expectations rather than on counting individual days. We prepare for examinations, journeys, celebrations, and major life changes by imagining future experiences. This ability to connect past experience with future possibilities is one of the oldest cognitive skills possessed by our species. It helped prehistoric communities survive, and it remains essential in modern life. Another surviving connection can be seen in the rhythms of the human body itself. Long before clocks existed, Human physiology evolved under recurring cycles of light and darkness. Modern science has shown that biological processes such as sleep, alertness, hormone production, and body temperature are strongly influenced by circadian rhythms. These rhythms do not originate from calendars or watches. They are responses to environmental conditions that shaped human evolution over immense spans of time. Even when people live in highly artificial environments, many aspects of their biology continue responding to patterns that would have been familiar to prehistoric ancestors. The same is true of certain emotional responses to seasonal change. Many people notice differences in mood, energy, or behavior during different parts of the year, often without consciously thinking about why. The natural world still influences human experience in subtle ways despite the presence of sophisticated timekeeping systems. Moments of direct awareness provide perhaps the clearest connection of all. Watching a sunset, noticing the first signs of spring, observing leaves changing color, hearing migratory birds return, or seeing a familiar landscape transformed by weather can create a sense of time that feels different from looking at a clock. In such moments, people become aware of change through observation rather than measurement. The experience is remarkably similar to the way prehistoric humans may have understood much of the world around them. For a brief time, attention shifts away from numbers and toward the unfolding processes of life itself. This does not mean modern people should abandon calendars or clocks. These tools are among humanity's most useful inventions. Rather, it suggests that our relationship with time contains multiple layers. One layer is measured, organized, and shared through systems. Another layer remains deeply personal, shaped by memory, expectation, experience, and biological rhythms. The prehistoric world never disappeared completely when calendars were invented. It continues to exist within the way human beings remember their past, imagine their future, and experience the passing of life. Beneath every schedule and every date remains a mind that was shaped long before formal timekeeping existed, a mind that still understands time not only as something counted, but also as something lived. As our journey comes to an end, the question that first brought us here feels very different from when we began. How did prehistoric humans live before clocks and calendars? The answer is no longer simply that they lived without them. Instead, we can see that they lived with something else. They lived with attention, they lived with memory, they lived with experience. Long before humanity learned to divide a day into hours or a year into numbered dates, people were already finding ways to understand the passage of life. They learned through growing older, through watching children become adults and adults become elders. They learned through preparation, responsibility, cooperation, and adaptation. They learned through successes that rewarded good judgment and through mistakes that taught difficult lessons. Time was not hidden inside devices or written on paper. It revealed itself through change. Every journey, every challenge, every achievement, and every generation offered evidence that life was always moving forward. Over thousands of years, this understanding helped human communities survive in environments that could be demanding, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. The people of prehistory did not possess the tools that modern societies rely upon, yet they were far from disconnected from time. In many respects, they experienced it more directly than we do. They encountered it in the growth of plants, in the aging of family members, in the development of skills, and in the countless transitions that shaped everyday existence. When calendars eventually appeared, they did not replace this older understanding. They built upon it. The ability to organize time, record it, and measure it emerged from generations of observation carried out by people who paid close attention to the world around them. Every calendar used today rests upon foundations laid by individuals who never saw a calendar. Every clock ultimately measures rhythms that human beings first encountered through experience long before they learned to count them. Perhaps this offers an educational lesson that extends beyond the history of timekeeping itself. Human knowledge rarely appears all at once. It accumulates gradually through curiosity, patience, and careful observation. The achievements of later civilizations were possible because countless ordinary people noticed patterns, remembered what they learned, and shared that knowledge with others. Progress often begins not with dramatic discoveries, but with the simple act of paying attention. This was true for prehistoric humans, and in many ways it remains true today. Even in a world filled with clocks, schedules, and digital reminders, there are still moments when we encounter time much as our distant ancestors once did. We notice a child growing taller. We realize that a familiar place has changed. We feel the arrival of a new season. We watch the years pass through the faces of the people we love. In those moments, time is no longer just a number. It becomes an experience once again. The tools of modern life help us organize time, but they do not fully define it. Beneath every calendar date remains the reality that life continues to unfold through change, memory, and experience, just as it did for those who lived thousands of years before us. And so, as the night grows quieter and this story finally reaches its end, perhaps the most remarkable truth is that although humanity has transformed the way it measures time, the deepest parts of our relationship with it may not have changed nearly as much as we imagine. We still remember, we still anticipate, we still grow older, and we still search for meaning within the passing years. If the people of prehistory learned to understand time by watching life itself unfold around them, and if we continue to do the same beneath all our clocks and calendars, then perhaps one final question remains drifting quietly into the darkness. When future generations look back on our lives, will they remember the dates we recorded, or the experiences that gave those dates meaning?